New York City. November 1968. The second annual All-American Open Karate Championships at Madison Square Garden. The largest karate tournament ever held on the East Coast of the United States, 300 competitors, 1,200 people in the seats, and among those 1,200 people, sitting in the fourth row on the east side of the floor with a press credential around his neck and a notepad on his knee, a 28-year-old man from Hong Kong named Bruce Lee who had driven down from his home in Bel Air with the specific intention of watching one fighter in particular. He had not told the fighter he was coming. Bruce Lee was, in November 1968, at one of the most complicated and productive junctures of his life. The Green Hornet had aired and been cancelled. He had spent 2 years teaching private lessons to some of the wealthiest and most connected men in Hollywood, James Coburn among them, Steve McQueen among them, men who paid serious money for the specific thing Lee had that no other martial arts instructor in Los Angeles possessed. He had developed Jeet Kune Do to a point where he could no longer describe it as a system without feeling that the description was a betrayal of what it actually was, which was less a system than a philosophy of motion, a set of principles that subordinated style to efficiency and efficiency to truth. He had been thinking about kicks. He had been thinking specifically about the gap between the kicks that his Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do background gave him and the kicks that he had watched certain Tang Soo Do and Taekwondo practitioners produce at tournaments. The gap was real and he knew it. The height, the extension, the chambering mechanics, the specific way that Korean martial arts generated power through the hip rather than through the ankle, all of it was a territory he had been mapping from a distance for the better part of a year. The fighter he had driven from Bel Air to New York to watch was Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris was 28 years old. He had won the All-American Grand Championship in 1967 and was defending his title in 1978. He had won 6 consecutive national titles across various tournaments and had established himself, in the judgment of every senior instructor and tournament judge on the circuit, as the most complete Tang Soo Do competitor in the country. His kicks were the specific thing. The spinning heel kick, the side kick with the hip loading that made it feel twice as heavy as it looked, the back fist kick combination that he had refined to a timing that the best fighters on the circuit still had not solved. He was also, by the consistent account of everyone who trained with him and competed against him, a man of very few words who taught what he knew without embellishment and without the performance that many instructors of his quality brought to the act of teaching. Lee had been watching him for the previous 2 years at tournaments he attended as a spectator. He had taken notes. The notepad on his knee at Madison Square Garden that afternoon was not the first notepad he had filled watching Norris compete. The tournament proceeded through its divisions. Norris competed in the way he always competed, which was with a control and economy that looked effortless to spectators who did not understand what they were watching and looked like something else entirely to spectators who did. Lee watched from the fourth row with the total attention he brought to everything that interested him, which was the attention of someone who was not watching a performance but conducting an analysis. He watched the hip position before each kick. He watched the weight transfer. He watched the chambering sequence and the extension angle and the recovery, and he made notes in a handwriting that the people who have seen those notes describe as extremely small and precise. Norris won the Grand Championship. He won it the way he had won it the year before, without drama and without apparent effort, with the calm of a man who had prepared for this specific problem so thoroughly that the problem, when it arrived, was already solved. After the trophy ceremony, the floor began to clear. Lee came down from the fourth row. He walked across the emptying tournament floor toward the area where Norris was standing with 2 of his senior students. He was not a large man. He was 5'7" and 135 pounds, and he moved with the specific economy of someone for whom motion had become a subject of permanent study. Several people in the remaining crowd recognized him. He did not acknowledge the recognition. He stopped in front of Chuck Norris. He introduced himself. Norris knew who he was. The Green Hornet had aired the previous year, and even in the martial arts community, which had opinions about the relationship between movie martial arts and real martial arts, Lee's reputation as a practitioner was separate from his reputation as an actor and was taken seriously on its own terms. Lee said that he had been watching Norris compete for 2 years at various tournaments. He said it without preamble, in the direct manner that people who have known him describe as one of his most consistent qualities, the quality of getting to the thing he actually meant without the social approach work that most people insert before saying what they came to say. He said that the hip mechanics of Norris's kicks were unlike anything produced by the Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do training that formed his own foundation, and that he believed they represented a solution to a specific problem he had been working on. Then he said the thing that he had come to New York to say. He asked Chuck Norris to teach him. The two senior students standing with Norris went quiet in the specific way that people go quiet when they register the weight of what has just been said. Bruce Lee had just asked a karate tournament champion to teach him something. This was not a thing that happened. Bruce Lee did not ask people to teach him things in this way. He trained with people. He exchanged techniques. He absorbed and discarded and synthesized. But the specific posture of a student making a request of a teacher, stated plainly and without qualification, was not a posture that anyone who knew Lee would have predicted seeing him take. Norris looked at him for a moment. He said later, in one of the few interviews in which he discussed this period in any detail, that his first thought was not about the request itself but about the precision with which it had been made. Lee had not asked to spar. He had not asked to train together in the general sense that fighters sometimes mean when they use that phrase as a way of assessing each other. He had identified a specific technical gap in his own foundation, located the person he believed was best positioned to address it, traveled from Los Angeles to New York to make the request in person, and stated the request without decorating it. Norris said yes. What followed over the next 14 months was a training exchange that neither man publicized and that was witnessed by only a small number of people, primarily senior students at Norris's school in Torrance, and two of Lee's private students in Los Angeles who were present during sessions at Lee's home. Lee traveled to Torrance on 8 separate occasions. Norris traveled to Bel Air on 4. The arrangement was not a formal instruction relationship. It was the specific arrangement that two technically serious people arrive at when both of them have something the other needs and both of them recognize it. What Norris gave Lee was the hip mechanics. The loading sequence that preceded the spinning heel kick and made it a weapon rather than a demonstration. The side kick chambering that placed the power source in the hip rotator rather than the quad extension. The specific footwork that created the distance required for the high kick to function against a resisting opponent rather than a compliant one. He taught these things the way he taught everything, without ornament, with demonstrations that were as clean and economical as his tournament fighting, with the patience of someone who had internalized the material so thoroughly that explaining it was simply a matter of finding the right sequence of words for what his body already knew. What Lee gave Norris was something that is harder to name but that Norris has described, in the decades since, in terms that are consistent enough across different interviews to be reliable. He gave him a framework. The specific philosophical architecture that Lee had been constructing for the previous 10 years, the insistence on testing technique against resistance, the rejection of style as an organizing principle in favor of efficiency, the question that Lee applied to everything he encountered, which was simply whether it worked and how well and under what conditions. Norris had been an empiricist in practice for his entire career without having the vocabulary for it. Lee gave him the vocabulary. The sessions in Bel Air were not primarily physical. They were long conversations about the relationship between principle and technique, about what a martial art was for and what happened to it when the answer to that question became unclear. The sessions produced things on both sides that were visible to people who watched both men train in the years that followed. Lee's kicks changed. The spinning heel kick that appears in Way of the Dragon, filmed in Rome in 1972, is a different kick from the kicks in his earlier films. The hip loading is there. The chambering sequence is there. The people who had watched him move before 1968 and who watched him move after noticed the difference, and most of them did not know what had produced it. Norris's thinking changed in ways that were less visible but that his longtime students describe as a deepening, a shift from a man who knew a great deal about how to fight to a man who had begun to think systematically about why the things he knew worked. The school he opened in Sherman Oaks in 1973 reflected this. The curriculum reflected this. The way he talked about martial arts in interviews in the 1970s reflected this, in the specific contrast between how he spoke before 1968 and how he spoke after. The last session between them was in early 1970. They remained in contact. When Lee began pre-production on Way of the Dragon in 1971, Norris was one of the first people he called. The casting of Norris as the villain in that film was not a commercial decision. It was the decision of a man who had spent 14 months learning from someone and who wanted to put what he had learned on screen in the most honest form available to him, which was opposite the person who had taught it to him. The bout they filmed in the Coliseum was not a real fight. Both men were clear about this in every interview they gave about it for the rest of their lives. It was a performance, A highly informed performance produced by two men who knew each other's movement the way people know movement they have studied at close range for over a year. The specific quality of that fight sequence, the reason it is still studied in martial arts schools around the world 50 years after it was filmed, is not separable from what happened in a tournament corridor at Madison Square Garden in November 1968 when a man with a notepad walked down from the fourth row and asked a question that almost nobody in the martial arts world of that year would have expected him to ask. He had watched Norris for 2 years. He had taken notes. He had made a decision. And then he had done the thing that the very gifted sometimes find most difficult, which was to stand in front of someone who had something he did not have and say so plainly, without apology and without the performance of humility that is not humility at all but only its appearance. The exchange that began that afternoon in New York was one of the most consequential in the history of American martial arts. It is not in any official record. There is no plaque at Madison Square Garden and no chapter in any standard martial arts history. It lives in the way things of this kind live, in the movement of two men captured on film, in the accounts of students who were present and who have described what they witnessed with the consistency of people reporting something real, and in the specific quality of a spinning heel kick thrown in a Roman Colosseum in 1972 by a man who had spent 14 months learning from the person standing across from him. There is one detail from those 14 months that Norris has mentioned only once, in a 1993 interview with a small martial arts publication that did not circulate widely enough to be picked up by the larger press. He was asked what the most surprising thing about training with Lee had been. He thought about the question for a moment in the way he thinks about questions, which is without performance, without the pause that people insert to signal that they are taking a question seriously. Then he said that what had surprised him most was not Lee's speed, which was what most people asked about, and not his strength, which was what most people expected him to mention. What had surprised him most was that Lee was wrong about things. Not often. But specifically and clearly wrong about certain technical matters, and what distinguished Lee from every other martial artist Norris had trained with or around was not that he was never wrong but that when you showed him he was wrong, the correction arrived in his body faster than in any other person Norris had ever watched learn something. Not in his mind. In his body. Most people, when they receive a correction, understand it mentally first and then spend weeks or months persuading their nervous system to accept it. Lee's nervous system accepted corrections at a speed that Norris described as the most unsettling physical phenomenon he had ever witnessed in a training environment. He said that this quality, more than the speed and more than the strength and more than the philosophy, was the thing he tried to carry with him when he went back to his own school in Torrance and stood in front of his own students. The willingness to be corrected. The specific physical openness to revision that made correction arrive in the body rather than stopping at the mind. He said that he had not always had it and that he was not certain he had fully developed it even after 14 months of watching it demonstrated by someone who had it completely. But he said that knowing it existed, knowing he had seen it, knowing what it looked like in a person who had it entirely, was something he had not had before that November afternoon at Madison Square Garden, and that it had changed the way he taught for the rest of his life. The notepad that Lee brought to Madison Square Garden that afternoon is not known to have survived. The notes from those sessions, if Lee kept them in written form, are not among the materials in the Bruce Lee Foundation archive as of the last public inventory.